Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon in Hungary and good evening in Tokyo. It's a great pleasure to have all of you with us today. And today we're going to have a very interesting conversation with two very interesting persons. First of all, Professor Taniguchi Tomohiko, professor at the Keio University in Japan, who's been also serving with the previous government of Japan under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And next to him, we have Dr. Tamás, Baranyi, the Deputy Director for Strategy at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And the topic today is a very interesting one in the sense that we're going to discuss that what kind of economic challenges Japan has to face after the pandemic and during the pandemic. And we will also try to compare this to the economic impetuses which are coming out of the United States. As many of you know, President Joe Biden has started his term about 3 months ago, so he's close to the 100 days mark. And his economic program, which focuses on soaring debt and certain government interventions, is already raising some questions in economic circles. So without any further ado, I would like to pass the virtual floor to Professor Taniguchi for his initial remarks. Then we will go to Dr. Baranyi, and then we will proceed to the Q&A session. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A panel, which is in the bottom menu bar of Zoom. Both if you're using the application or if you're using the online client. So please make sure that you ask your questions here and I will read them out aloud. You can also use the chat function once again reachable in the bottom menu bar to ask a question and I will raise them to the panelists. So Professor Taniguchi, once again, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me. And it's a great pleasure for me to address the audience in Hungary. It sounds almost as if it was a light years ago when I strolled around a beautiful city against which your moderator is sitting. Now, about Japanese economy, its challenges. The combination of easy monetary policy and expansionist fiscal policy have to go on for some time. And that's been in place since Shinzo Abe came back in office December 2012. Prior to that, Japanese foreign exchange rate vis-a-vis US dollar was forbiddingly expensive, forbidding in the sense that it made it virtually impossible for some of the export-oriented companies to maintain their businesses on the soil of Japan. Corporate tax rate extremely high, and Japan was very much slow in joining the club of free traders. Fast forward to the present. During the pandemic, let's just admit it, many businesses have gone out, especially in the retail industry and catering businesses and restaurants and so on, hotels and inns. They were the worst hit, as is the case with many other nations. The bullet train that runs between Tokyo and Osaka via Kyoto has lost its passengers by roughly 70%. Nonetheless, something astonishing is also going on. That is to say, the number of business failures that have gone bankrupt and so on hit its historical, not high, but low. The number of business failures marked its 30-year low last year. And many people are scratching their heads, but a consensus has emerged that the government's rescue package that is composed of very much easy loans and subsidies and so on, the number of business failures has been very, very low. So technically, the Japanese economy is faring all right at the moment. And the best moment in our recent past, in the Japanese economy's recent past, was in the year 2019, 1 year before pandemic. 98 out of 100 job-seeking college students earned jobs. The same went, amazingly, with high school graduates. 98 out of 100 job-seeking high school graduates also were able to find their jobs. Even the number of homeless people went down. So Abenomics worked very well. And the number of people who killed themselves hit also its historical low during the Abe administration. The child poverty rate, persistently high, started to go down compared to the median number for OECD nations. What about the future? And that's a totally different picture, because a Japanese structural problem is deeply rooted, one of which is, of course, the issue of societal aging. Um, the working age population is constantly shrinking. The government of Japan under Shinzo Abe tried to offset that negative development by encouraging senior citizens to remain in the job market, and by encouraging, first and foremost, more and more women to remain and enter the job market. However, the steepness of the decline of the population is such that it's an uphill struggle, the repercussion of which can be seen in many areas of the economy. But let me just tell you just one example. That is about the total size of Japanese welfare expenditure, some 60% of which is currently financed by taxpayers' money. The rest comes from contributions of the employers and the employed. However, the total size of the expenditure, welfare expenditure, is in Japanese yen, 130 trillion yen. 130 trillion yen is a big, big number, because, listen to me, it is equal or slightly less than, equal to or slightly less than the defense budget of the United States, defense budget of China, of Russia, of India, of Saudi Arabia. US, China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia. These are 5 biggest defense spenders. If you combine the annual spending on defense of these 5 countries, that is more or less roughly the same as the amount the Japanese are spending for welfare provision. It's a heavy, heavy burden. And the people in the younger generations know that in the future, this burden will gain weight even further. They know that it's going to be even harder for them to maintain the welfare system as is. What can you do about this in these circumstances? One has to get reminded that in order for one economy, either Hungarian or Japanese, to grow, you have only 3 supply side channels. On the demand side, that's a different story, but on the supply side, you get either labor input, capital stock, and productivity. Japan is losing labor input. And in those circumstances, it's hard for entrepreneurs to be risk-friendly and spend more and more on capital. The remaining channel is productivity. And there is no panacea for productivity. That's part of the problem. What should you do really to enhance your productivity? You can say a lot of things, but there is no silver bullet. But one thing is for sure. If you look at retail industries and mom and pop shops in Japan, it is there that the productivity is low. And digital transformation is yet to come for those sectors, which I think is why Suga administration from day one has repeatedly stressed that digital transformation must be something that should be cherished, not only by major companies, but also by medium and small-sized entities. What could Japan do on that aspect? And in general terms, what will Japan do in the future to face up to this deep-rooted problem pertinent to the societal aging is something that you should keep an eye on, because Japan is a forerunner in many respects in terms of tackling these challenges. I will stop here. I have spoken for 10 minutes, and I will hand my microphone to Dr. Baranyi.
Thank you, Professor Taniguchi, and also thank you for raising these points. And it was very interesting for me to hear that Japan, a country which we usually associate with a high level of automation and productivity, is still facing some challenges in this regard. But it's absolutely worth looking at the Japanese experience to see that what will come to Europe in a couple of years, I think. And with that, I would like to pass it over to my colleague Tamás Baranyi, and then after his intervention, we will go to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Márton, and thank you very much, Professor Taniguchi, for these eye-opening remarks. I'm here to discuss a little bit Bidenomics, because the title of this panel is Suganomics, Bidenomics, and it's not an easy job because comparing these two is not as obvious as their obviously similar names would suggest. I think the economic policies of the new administration, the Biden administration, is rather very much in the making still. What I think to be more important than that, and also like more developed at this point, is the philosophy behind the Biden administration's economic policies and their, let's say, avowed goals in the economy. And I think we have to identify 3 points of departure against the background against which the whole idea has been developing for quite some time now, and also see some examples of which way the administration can choose. So for the major, let's say, historical trends against which the new, let's say, Bidenomics, if that's a good term, I'm really unsure if it's a good term anyway. But let's say the emerging economic in the new administration, and call it Bidenomics for now. So I think the underlying trends include that more and more economic orthodoxies were questioned in the past few years. One of them that has to be cited here as an example is how the Trump administration actually questioned the notion of the primacy of free trade and its advantages for the economy. there were many others that have been questioned during years. Just to say that there is a strong feeling among those who are dealing with economic policies that in the past, let's say 10 years, the normal working of economy was not growth, indeed, but more like stagnation. And this in turn questioned some of those orthodoxies. Also, I think that's a very interesting process how the mainstream in the United States, both in politics and also in particular economic policies, shifted to the left in the past decade. I think after 2008, neoliberal has become, less of a self-label than more like a labeling for others. It was no longer really something that really formed a self-conscious club, more like, a little derogatory term for something of an old economics. And I think this, the new administration informs its economic policies not from the establishment itself, really rather from left-leaning academia and left-leaning think tank circles that are obviously more open to question those orthodoxies, and that's again a very important factor. And I think it is part of the reason the whole shift of the electorate to the left of the Democratic Party that is responsible for this more like left-leaning economic outlook of the new administration. And of course, the third most important factor is, the coronavirus hitting in and its rather selective destruction of the economy and, let's say, the social fabric itself, because, it's not beyond material devastation. COVID-19 disproportionately hit in certain sectors like the services sector, tourism, and the like. And that's indeed a very important development, in my view, that more and more people are living not really from the market, but from government, let's say government-raised monies, and this situation was perpetuated. So early 2012, they thought it was going to be temporary, but it's more than a year has passed, and the situation did not change dramatically, although it's getting better in terms of the epidemic, but still more and more and wider government interventions are needed to tackle these problems. The need to tackle these problems is, I think, is a very important third factor that shapes the new economic policies. Actually, it has already started under President Trump, even though with a much less comprehensive manner. But we should remember that last March 2012, the early versions of the Corona legislation packages were actually bipartisan in nature, which is all the more interesting and important that given the let's say the traditionally pro-business constituency of the Republican Party in the United States, though you have to admit that this is something that also changes. So I think those are the three main processes that actually inform the economic policies of the new administration. But I have to emphasize that there is a long way to go. So those are not really policies yet. And okay, just one more observation about the whole outlook of the Biden administration is that it employs economic politicians, economists with excellent backgrounds, excellent academic backgrounds, and so forth, but very little or very few practitioners. And that's a huge difference compared to the Trump administration. So Janet Yellen and her crew and the whole economic background team of the Biden administration, more like coming from the academia rather than practitioners. And this is something that is not not only compared to the Trump administration, I would say this is fairly unusual in any administration in the United States. It can have a beneficial effect, but you don't have to have too big a fantasy to think of how it can be derailed because of the lack of really on the spot experiences. And I think part of this new emerging consensus or emerging economic outlook in the United States is, again, getting back to the core, is that the economy doesn't work on potential, really. And this was one of the orthodoxies before, but I think the general truth that they are base their economic views is that slack is the new economic normal. So growth is not something that you have to let be, because the markets will generate growth if there are no obstacles, but rather quite the other way around. So this is growth that is this is the non-normal working of the economy. So you have to provocate this growth in some manner, and this manner is, of course, the low interest rates and definitely a more active fiscal policy and very active and very targeted government spending. You can also say that it's nothing new because it is, has a lot to do with, classic Keynesianism. But this sort of, return to a certain form of Keynesianism is being done in a context that it's heavily, liberalized since then, and also under stress because of the coronavirus and the like. So it's not, I would say, just a return to Keynesianism. It's some sort of adopting to it. And some of the steps already taken by the Biden administration, in my view, actually strengthen this very point of view. I would, in particular, just raise 3 points. There was this legislation about the $3,000 trillion stimulus package, which in itself is tremendous, and it has the effect that the government debt skyrocketed, and because of the macroeconomic situation, it is for now not considered as a problem. But some of the economists actually raised their voice of concern. Now we're going to see. It seems a risky decision, but definitely could be great enough to generate growth. The second point is actually part of this package. This package involves a major infrastructural development project. If we remember, one of the campaign promises of Donald Trump was also, initiating major infrastructural reforms. I personally, pretty much agreed with this, and many Americans. Interestingly enough, this was one of the campaign promises of Donald Trump that was not really, taken into account later on. So obviously, this is something that is not very easy to implement in the United States with its federal nature, with its many particular interests on the spot, and also their actually limited construction capacities. But still, this is something of a very classic way to enhance growth in the economy, and also to raise the living standard the quality of the way of living for many who live in underdeveloped regions with outdated infrastructure. So this is, I think, should be a cornerstone, and this is something that, as I said, many American presidents have tried to do before, but was proved not that easy to implement before that. So I think this is probably this is the second thing that it needs to be mentioned as a very definitive steps. And the third one is raising the corporate tax levels, which is expected to be to pay off for this high government spending. But again, this is something very unusual in the United States, but there is also some talk about trying to implement and sort of enforce a global minimum corporate tax. And this is something, again, of a very unusual character. And it remains to be seen how effective it would be and what the rest of the world would say about this process. However, on the whole, we see that there is a very high ambition level here. And the reinvigorating the economy is definitely a good goal, but obviously can be debated, the means that they imply. And I will also add that under this stress, the stress of the coronavirus, which actually impacts the whole globe, I think the outcome is rather questionable and remains to be seen. Not only the outcomes, but also, the very definitive shape of this policy. And interestingly enough, even though, Abenomics, Suganomics are also, let's say, political buzzwords that actually imply, complicated reform packages to reinvigorate the economics. In many ways, those are in a very different direction than this emerging sort of Bidenomics. Okay, so those were my raw thoughts about the new economic policies of the Biden administration, and I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tamás, for these points, and I would just like to jump on two of them and pose them as a question to Professor Taniguchi before we go to the Q&A. We already have two questions from the audience. The first is the question of the global corporate income tax rate. Professor Taniguchi, do you think that this is viable, and would this help the economic reforms in Japan? That is the first question. And the other is about public debt and outspending the crisis, if you wish, because taking out loans might sound like a good idea because you don't have to pay for it. The next generation will have to pay for it. But at the end of the day, someone will have to pay for it. And you also have to raise money from private equity funds or other sources to finance these projects. So do you think that this is a viable alternative to help to overcome the economic crisis in the wake of the pandemic? And after that, we'll go to the questions of the audience. And please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First, about corporate tax, the problem is that there are many multinational companies such as Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon.com that have been headquartered nowhere. It is technically the US company and doing a lot of business in many countries, including Japan, but they're not paying corporate tax either to the United States, to the UK, to Japan. And the special committee within the OECD has been looking into this challenge for about a decade. And with the introduction of the Obama administration that is leaving behind low tax regime, as was pointed out by Mr. Baranyi, is urging the rest of the world to come along with the United States, not to lower corporate tax rate anymore, but to put a bottom on the competition as regards corporate tax rate. I think Japan is going to be on the same wavelength, if you like, with the administration of Mr. Biden's, because there is a recognition that the lowering of corporate tax rate is in a way akin to a beggar thy policy first and foremost. And the biggest challenge for any country in the world is what to do with corporates that are footloose and very much hard to tax. The next time the G7 countries and G20 countries will meet, I think this is one of the biggest issues that leaders from many nations must tackle. Secondly, um, your second question is very much relevant, but the Japanese economic challenge is such. May I once again reiterate, saying there is no single silver bullet to cure Japanese economy. I think the most fundamental problem here is the lack of hope among the young. They are risk averse, perhaps because they grew up when Japanese economy hit its historical low. Unless and until you get a population who is expecting a brighter future, you could do nothing. So it's a circular argument. You need growth, but how can you generate growth with a population that is not so much forthcoming? So all sorts of things have to be done. And the Japanese government under Shinzo Abe slightly uh, began a shift in terms of welfare policy. In other words, started to rewrite its social contract from the one heavily geared toward the elderly to the one geared toward the young and childbearing generation. For any democratically run government, I think it's the most difficult challenge to write and rewrite social contract, but one has to face up to that within a time frame whereby Japanese public debt, government debt, is still being financed 90 some percent by domestic savers. If you start selling a massive amount of your government obligations to foreigners, your financial situation is going to be much, much more complex, and you are going to be a captive to the international financial market. Luckily, Japan has yet to come to that point, but you don't have much time, so you have to concentrate whatever is available on those deep-rooted challenges.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate your comment on the ownership of Japanese debt that is owned domestically. So the country is not so vulnerable to the outside market forces. And with that, we will go to the questions of the audience, and not surprisingly, most of them go to you, Professor Taniguchi.
Sure.
First of all, in your initial remarks, you have mentioned that innovation policy and digitalization is something that the Suga government has to deal with, especially with small and medium enterprises, family-owned businesses, so not the great multinational companies and the zaibatsus, but down on the lower level. And we were just wondering, and the Anna Kala, who's asking this question, was wondering that what was the role of the government of Japan in moving innovation policy forward? What were the main achievements of the Abe government, and what we can expect of the Suga government in the next couple of years?
Thank you very much. That's also very much a relevant question. If the number of Nobel laureates is any indication, Japan's is currently 28. Soviet Russia combined 31, but the rest of Asia you only have China, that of which number is 8. So Japan, out of the Atlantic nations, has been doing fairly well in terms of developing basic scientific research, the outcome of which has provided this number, has brought about this number of 28 Nobel laureates. What about the future? One cannot be so much optimistic because it's basically related to the money available for basic scientific research. And let me give you a broad thumbnail picture about the Japanese budgetary situation. If you look at Japan's annual budget, the size of which is awesome, the Japanese government budget is bigger in size than the GDP for Turkey or the GDP for Saudi Arabia. So you can say, wow, Japan's government is running a huge amount of budget. Then you could spend a lot of money on basic scientific research, innovative attempts, and so on. Unfortunately, only 30% of which is available for new policy endeavors. Why? You get government bond obligations. You must pay back your government bond obligations. You must help support municipalities, and you must help support the elderly. None of these 3 elements can be reduced so easily. They are entitlement cost. The rest 30% is the source for all kinds of things. You must pay more to your police officers. You must pay more to your armed forces. And you must help support educational activities, basic scientific research. The bottom line is the same. You need to grow. And I would very much like Japanese economy to grow at least by 2%. If you grow by 2% in 35 years, your economy is going to be twice as large as it is now. But if you grow by only 1%, it'll take 70 years. Meanwhile, next door, the Chinese leaders are talking about growing by 6 point some percent, which means in 10 to 12 years, the Chinese economy, already big, is going to be doubly big. So no one is standing still. You must grow. And how can you grow without giving a source of hope and higher expectations to the young generation? And that's the task that Prime Minister Suga has to continue to face up to.
You briefly touched upon the question of China, and it's a very tough one because Japan is interested in economic cooperation. We see the RCEP negotiations concluding last year, forming a larger framework of free trade agreements in the Pacific Basin. But at the same time, we all know that China is posing some very traditional security threat to Japan. And let me be very honest with you. I'm asking this question to all of the people I talk with from Japan, that how you can balance the security interests and the economic interests when it comes to handling China. And I think that the United States is facing a similar dilemma, with the advantage of having the entire Pacific Ocean between China and the US, but Japan is basically next door. So how you can solve this dilemma in the long run? Is it possible to solve it anyway?
One must do a lot to strike a good balance between the two challenges that you mentioned. Scott Morrison, Prime Minister of Australia, once mentioned that it is a challenge for Australia to cut a balance between its security interests and economic interests. But for that matter, the challenge is more dire for Japan. And Prime Minister Abe did a lot of those attempts to strike the balance. And he is a mentor for me. And that's what Scott Morrison said about the question you just posed. There is no simple answer, but the situation has become such that nothing can be achievable alone by yourself, be it about Chinese industrial policy, be it about Chinese industrial espionage, cyber strategies, and let alone China's military buildup, which is why you need to hoist a banner high that yours is an open, accountable, democratic system. And you need to have an environment in which Toyota, Nissan, Honda, and others can do businesses safely in China, while at the same time, you need to push back coercive Chinese diplomacy and security policies in the China seas, east and south. And currently, Japan is trying to cut that balance with like minded partners, including its traditional treaty ally of the United States, but more of late with Australia, India, and so on. So the combined effort is something that is necessary, and I think Japanese government is pursuing the same path down the road.
Thank you. And so far the final question, but I think in the meantime, the audience will ask new ones, and I would like to encourage everybody to ask their questions. We still have about 15 minutes left of this seminar. So the question goes once again to you, Professor Taniguchi, that industrial policy in the EU gained significant impetus over the last 2 decades, with the Recovery and Resilience Facility being the first time of a meaningful financial background for that. So Europe will also have a significant amount of money to revive its economy. Of course, we'll have to see the results, but there's a general sense of optimism. And we see that in the case of Japan, after the Second World War, the state has played a very significant role in rebuilding the economy, and the industrial policy of the Japanese government has played a pivotal role in that. And the question is that how would you evaluate the role of the developmental state on the one hand, and also the role of the industrial policy of Japan in the last 2-3 decades, and what lies ahead, what we can expect in the next 10 years, maybe?
19 years after the end of the Second World War, in the year 1964, Japan became a full-fledged member of the International Monetary Fund. The country also joined the OECD. 4 years after that, in 1968, Japan became the second largest capitalist economy, passing Germany. But between 1950 and 1964, Japan chronically experienced shortage of foreign currency. And the Japanese government played a central role in distributing that scarce resource of the United States dollar, hard currency, and it favored heavy industries such as steel mills, shipbuilders, and so on. It worked because, at any rate, Japan was in short, the foreign currency was in short supply so much. But when you think about Japanese brand names, you may perhaps think about Suzuki, that is doing a fairly successful business in Hungary. Has it come to where it is by the Japanese government support? The answer is absolutely not. The same goes with Honda, Toyota, Nissan. They were largely out of the government support. The most successful industries that Japan has so far had have had very little Japanese government support. That's the truth of the matter. And in addition to that, the Japanese government is not running the kind of budget, as I told you a moment ago, from which they can spend lavishly to help support growing industries. What is the Japanese government doing now? Two things. It is to blow a cowbell, if you like, indicating that this is the way that you should go. Currently, that direction is set in order for Japan to achieve carbon neutral by the year 2050. You need to do a lot of things to achieve that, but innovation holds key here. That's one thing. Second, the most important thing is education. Education for the young, education for the mid-career people. For instance, my school, I belong to a system design and management graduate school. I don't have an engineering degree, but my school is about engineering, and it is basically for someone in his or her late 30s or early 40s. And it's now called recurrent education. And the annual fee the school asks students to pay is something like 20,000 US dollars. That's very much affordable. However, it is one of the most expensive as school tuitions in Japan. Luckily, this country is still running affordable education system in its higher education. And I would very much like it to continue, because down the road, education will count even more, because that's an ultimate source of innovation, because innovation comes from human brains, and you need to constantly educate that future generation.
And possibly with the rapid changes in technology, you have to re-educate people once in a while, 5 or 10 years, because everything has changed so quickly. Tamás, you indicated you also would like to ask a question. Go ahead, please.
Yes, just one short observation and one question. My observation is, it was exciting to hear your interventions, Mr. Taniguchi. I really like when, at the end of an economic argument lies in an extra economic domain, like education, or how the younger generation actually thinks about the future, whether they have a positive view of the future or not. I think those are the very important things in economy indeed. But my question goes somewhere else, more practical things. So I think I've read about the new Japanese Prime Minister, that he's expected to be much tougher on those, structural reform arrows, that is part of, the Abenomics, Suganomics, that is expected to be more tough with, pushing through those reforms. And then I don't know, how do you see the situation on the ground? Do you see that there will be a difference in the outlook of the new government? Could it be more successful in this sense? How do you see that?
All right. In the Q&A section, I see two more questions, but I'd be happy to deal with those questions. But before that, what about the Suga administration? Frankly speaking, it's too early to say because in several months, he is going to face the most serious challenges, plural. First, he's going to probably have to dissolve Japanese lower house, House of Representatives, and call general elections. And he must carry a massive victory. And only after that, he would be elected easily again as president of his own party, the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. Under Japanese parliamentary system, the head of the biggest ruling party is going to be endorsed as prime minister on the floors of the house, both houses. So only after that, I should say, Mr. Suga is going to address some of the issues that he wants to address himself. Whether he could be tougher on structural issues is going to be tested only after those two elections. When it comes to structural issues, the most deep rooted one is about the aging society. How can you redistribute wealth among generations? How can you shift your focus from the elderly to the young? And that's easy to say, but really, really difficult to do. And you need to have a big, big amount of political capital and the longevity of the government. Until and unless you have those assets, I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone, be it Suga or anyone else, to tackle those structural problems. My fingers are crossed.
Well, thank you for underlining once again that it's important to have the mandate from the general electorate to implement these kind of reforms, and accountability remains front and center in every democracy because people tend to forget that from time to time. So the last two questions, first is a follow-up question from Arpad that he asked the question about the developmental state, and he reads your answer in a way that the role of the developmental state in Japan is a bit overstated if we count it until the 1990s, but maybe we should only count it until the 1960s. Is that correct?
Well, I see the reason why this question was raised. There is a wisdom widely available in the area of international political economy that Japan showcased its first successful model of developmental state. And that theory was pushed first by a US scholar named Chalmers Johnson. He looked into Japanese Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Trade and Industry, and he wrote a very thick book saying that Japan used its money, capital, whatever, to choose the winner of the race and concentrated Japanese government money on those industries. The fact of the matter is, although Nippon Steel, Mitsubishi Heavy, and those brick and mortar companies succeeded in growing market share and earning profits, but the most successful industries were not in those areas. And those are the companies that push the Japanese government hard to give them money and were resisted by the Japanese government, refused by the Japanese government. Honda is a prime example. Its founder, Soichiro Honda, himself a genius engineer, went to Ministry of Industry and Trade many times, urging the ministry to pay a little bit of government subsidies to his own company. But he met a stone-faced bureaucrats, one of whom said that you are running a motorcycle company. Yours is two-wheeled. You cannot build something four-wheeled. And that's what Honda had to hear from MITI. So developmental state model was out of sync with what actually happened in Japan, even in the 1960s, let alone 70s and 80s.
So once again, it seems that the market played its role. And the final question is a question I also wanted to ask to you, Professor Taniguchi, about migration. You mentioned that one of the problems Japan is facing is aging society and the lack of labor force. And despite the fact that many graduates can find jobs right away once they come out of university, this remains an issue. And I remember that I think in 2018, there was a debate in the Japanese Diet about whether foreign workers should be admitted to the Japanese labor market, especially in jobs related to social care and care for the elderly and so on and so forth. And on the one hand, what do you think about importing labor force into Japan to ease this kind of pressure? And also, is there any outflow of Japanese citizens to other places in the world? So how do you see the migration dynamics, especially from the economic point of view?
The latter part of your question is relatively easier for me to answer because, yes, there are people who are going out of Japan to seek new opportunities elsewhere, but the number has remained all the time relatively small. I wouldn't say negligible, but very small. And that separates the Japanese pattern from the patterns observable in China, South Korea, and so on. The Japanese American community, if you look at it, is constantly shrinking, not growing. That's evidence of the situation about the outflow of people. What about the inflow? I would encourage those of you who have higher education degrees and seek opportunities to work for Japanese companies to come and seek your opportunities in Japan, because in this country, obtaining a permanent residency visa for you, which is basically Japanese green card, equivalent of green card, is among the easiest in the world. It takes only 1 year for someone with high marks to obtain the permanent residency visa. And that was introduced also under the administration of Shinzo Abe. And Suga was always Abe's right-hand person. He knew everything about that. And Suga was very much instrumental in selling Japanese tourism destinations abroad. Prior to COVID, I was sometimes devastated whenever I was in Kyoto because I heard very little Japanese language spoken there. In the most expensive shopping district of Tokyo, which is called Ginza, you had a huge number of tourist buses coming in, and out of which came a number of Chinese shoppers, which is good news for shop owners, but caused controversy elsewhere. And Suga opened the floodgate for foreign visitors. And once again, I should stress that after this pandemic, please come and see Japan through your own eyes. This country is not so much expensive. Everything is affordable and clean and tidy. So come and see through your own eyes. And under Suga's leadership, as well as Shinzo Abe's, Japan opened its doors for the first time substantially to workers. In other words, laborers, by which it means that you don't necessarily have to have college degrees, let alone graduate degrees. And they are welcome for construction industry, hotel industry, restaurant businesses, and so on. And people just started to flow in massive number prior to pandemic. And after that, after the pandemic, whether they will return is a question that you should keep an eye on. Speaking of foreigners, they're basically from 3 countries, and that's something that you should remember: China, Vietnam, and either Philippines or Indonesia, and South Korea. And herein, one finds a different and difficult dilemma once again, because it is the Chinese government that can control the flow of people from China to other nations. Once they say, we're not going to send anyone over to you, Japan, and that's something that Beijing can do. I don't think Hungary can do that. Any other nation can do that. I cannot do that. But Beijing can control the flow of people. So Taiwan, for instance, had to suffer massively from this policy because Beijing stopped sending tourists to Taiwan. The same thing is happening vis-a-vis Australia. 1 out of 3 foreign students in Australia was from China, and China could squeeze Australian education industry that way. And I think Japan is going to have a similar situation. That's once again very much a difficult dilemma that the future Japanese governments must handle.
Thank you very much. And I have to say that to the credit of Kyoto, I do understand that why so many tourists like to go there, because it's a wonderful city. But this unfortunately brings us to the end of the conversation today. I think I've learned a lot, and of course many challenges remain, but we will see that how the election will go, if Prime Minister Suga will call for one, and also that how we will emerge from the economic crisis in the wake of the pandemic. But with that, I would like to thank both of our panelists, first of all, Professor Taniguchi, and also my colleague Tamás Baranyi, for joining us today and sharing their thoughts. I'm sure that this is not the last time we are meeting, and hopefully we will be able to welcome all of you soon at our premises and meet in person and continue these conversations over the coffee breaks and the evenings, and if everything else which was associated with the so-called good old times before the pandemic. So thank you again. It was a pleasure to host you virtually, and I hope to see all of you soon.
Well, thank you very much. I like arrangements like this very much. I can sit in my humble study room and address the audience in Hungary. So the next time you think it is appropriate for you to have me, I am at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And have a great evening. Have a great afternoon for all of those of you in Hungary. And see you soon in our events. Thank you very much. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.